Hey everyone, welcome to the Kontent Rocks podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about a very important topic if you're using content in your day-to-day process, and that is workflow and the workflow abilities that content has to create quality content. This is your host, Brian McKeiver, and again, this is the podcast about all things content by Kentico, .NET, Azure, and even a little Jamstack in there. And I'm really pleased to once again be joined by a good friend of mine and developer advocate at Kontent, Ondrej Polesny. Ondrej, how are you doing?
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me. I'm great today.
Good, good. So, Ondrej, I just want to make sure that everyone knows what do you do for content. Let's cover that really quickly. Tell everyone what your day-to-day looks like, and then we'll dive right into this topic of workflow.
Right. So the official job title is a developer evangelist. What it means is whatever happens in the DevRel part of the company, I try to show that to the world. I also take care of the MVP team, which you of course are part of for a long time. And what we're trying to do is essentially help developers understand what we offer and help them use the product to its best ability and to make sure that their jobs are as easy as possible.
And I think you do a fantastic job of that. I know that you've put out a lot of tutorials on your YouTube channel, on Twitter, even taking care of some of the sites and the program. And I think you've done a great job for the community. So I commend you for all that activity. And I know you're pretty passionate about it as well. So that's pretty darn cool when you can bring those things together.
Thanks, Brian.
Yep. But I mean, let's get into it. If you're watching this episode or listening, you saw the title. It's going to be about workflow. And it's funny because I talk to a lot of teams who are maybe new to any CMS world, right? Maybe they've just kind of not had a CMS, whether it's a traditional or a headless or DXP. It almost doesn't matter. When we talk about how do we make sure quality content is accomplished and what tools there are to make sure that we're not being inefficient in our processes, the concept of workflow comes up all the time. And it's something that not everybody actually has a great handle on at the beginning. The lucky thing is, though, after you kind of explain it and maybe even show a little bit, people usually catch on to it pretty quickly, and then they appreciate having this process in place. And it's a very cool thing to see it kind of come to life from before. It may have been just whoever last edited and saved the page was the final copy that got out to the website or whatever platform you're powering with your CMS, to have now a structure and a process in place. And I don't know if you've seen that or not, Ondrej, in your work, but definitely I think there's a lot of education room for what are workflows and how to use them and how they provide value.
Definitely. It's maybe a bit weird coming from me as I'm working with technical audiences, and a typical developer, they just want the content, they want to work with the API, they're interested about the SDK, they want to get their hands on code as soon as possible. But workflows are kind of on the other side. Yeah, before you actually get the content through the API, through the CDN, someone has to create the content, someone has to work on it, someone has to translate it, someone has to review it. And in those cases, like for very simple projects and getting started, this is usually a feature that you don't see there. But as your project grows, and it doesn't have to be like a big team, yeah, it can be a team of 4 or 5 editors, including the developer. And at that time, you already need a workflow. I would say it's like when 2 developers are working on one project, you definitely need Git to track the changes, to have a history there. I think workflow is a very similar thing on content, when you need to have some kind of governance, some kind of order in how things are propagating towards the production site or any other channel.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And in fact, I think it's very easy for developers to skip this step in some systems and not actually even add it at the beginning of a project. And then maybe at the very end, like someone says, oh, hey, what about this? And maybe it's added in, and it actually can cause problems. At least in years past in old legacy CMSs, we had that issue a lot where maybe the code didn't work the right way if a piece of content was in draft mode only because the API wasn't structured or the person didn't implement it correctly. And you actually could shoot yourself in the foot to not consider it at the beginning of the project. And that's one thing I really appreciate by content is that there is a default workflow out of the box right away, out of the gate. You actually can't skip workflow because puts every piece of content in that default workflow already. And we're going to look at that here in a second. But it's a nice little thing that it kind of gets you as a developer used to dealing with it right from the beginning. Because even working with things through the management API, you actually have to respect workflow when you're maybe doing your initial load of content from another system, or just working with content items in general. There's this concept of workflow step. It really matters, especially when you get into like the delivery API showing published content and the preview API only showing draft mode content. It's really critical to understand this, which is why I'm very excited to talk about it today and share some examples that we have.
Yeah, it's exactly as you say. You mentioned the preview API, so that's a great example of how you can use the draft content. And then again, developers already use workflows in their Git, right? When you create a pull request, when you do a commit, those are similar things. Yeah. So even if you're storing content, if you don't have a headless CMS and you're storing stuff in Markdown files, and you commit them in GitHub in a specific branch, and then you create a pull request, it's as if you are working with a workflow. So headless CMS is just make it easier and split, the code from content and make it nice for everyone to use it and not even think about it.
Yep. Okay, so we have two main examples today. One, we'll just start with kind of like a getting started example of what are the basics of how the system starts up, and then maybe some advanced features that it can actually do. And then after that, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and Ondrej is going to show us a great example of a real-world project that we both kind of work on that utilize this to accomplish a need that we had. So I don't want to give it away yet, but let's start with the basics in case you're new. So I'm going to quick add in the Kontent AI user interface here and the screen share in case you're just listening. What I have is our content inventory, and I'm at the home dashboard of the content tool, and I can see I've got a couple pieces of content ready that are currently being worked on because they're in draft mode, and yet there might have been a version published. But if we look at this a little bit, right away, just dealing with content, workflow comes right to the front and center. We have this column that says what workflow step is in, so we can kind of understand maybe where this content is being displayed on our websites or not. And that's one thing I really appreciate about the interface is it really calls out very concretely where things are. It doesn't hide it. But in case you're starting from nothing and you have 0 in your content project, you might actually want to start at the project settings. That's where the creation and management of workflow happens. And as I move over to project settings and then workflows, we actually have 2 different workflows enabled for this project. It's just a sample project, so I've been kind of setting this up as a demo. But out of the gate, you're going to have what's known as the default workflow in content. And it's set up to touch all content types and kind of be your safety net, right? In case that you were trying to be very creative and adding content types to certain workflows and missing the here and there, and something goes wrong, you actually can't shoot yourself in the foot because this always applies to all of the default content. At least that's kind of what we were actually just talking about before the show, right, Ondrej? It was the whole idea of we want to make sure that there's always something.
Yeah, I agree. And I see if you've done quite some work on this one. And that's perfectly fine because the default workflow only gives you 3 steps: draft, published, and archived. And it's up to every agency, to every project manager, how to set it up in a way that works for you, because every team has a different requirements, every project has a different requirement. And then the default workflow actually, as you said, Brian, makes sure that even if you don't think about it, you never lose any content that you're working on. And it's like like you said, it's like a safety net for everything else. And then, of course, you can add additional workflows based on the type of content. But I assume you're going to show that in a second.
Yes. Great segue. So before we talk about the usage, let's talk again about the setup and management of it. A workflow is made up of workflow steps, as we can see here. And Ondrej kind of hit on the head on the nail. The nail on the head. Wow, that's not a really great way to say it. Each step has a name and a color and a set of transitions to move between the next part of the flow and or the previous. So it sounds a little complicated. And as I open up this screen, maybe some things are a little overwhelming to a brand new user. But generally, it's just where am I at on this named step? and where can I move to, or where can I move back in case I want to discard changes. So the most traditional way I think about this is you always start in draft or edit mode, and you usually would want to maybe go right to published as you finish working on your content. Sometimes you might go to other steps, which is actually what this one is showing, because maybe you have a different team member who has to review metadata and look at SEO and make sure all the other fields are meeting the content guidelines, meeting the best practices of your organization. And it really allows you to kind of set this up to go from that level of SEO approval to the next level to the next level. And when you combine the step transitions with the roles of who can manage which things, that gives you the sort of strength of content governance around your content. So right now we're looking at the first draft step in the workflow. We can go to a couple different next steps, and all roles can do this. But if we start looking a little further down, and let me maybe go down the chain and look at the SEO verification step in the process, you'll notice that we have a different set of steps we can go back to or forward to, because we don't want to block anyone from doing their job. So maybe SEO verification is truly optional and you can skip it. This setup allows for that. But if you want to be very strict and actually say that, you know what, you actually can't go backwards or can't go forwards, you simply would delete these other transitions away from there, and you'd have a very linear process that is 100% enforced. And you can even add and change the roles of who can move each piece of content into which step. So if you do want to check out the actual full documentation on how to do this, you can simply do that on the Kontent Docs site. And we'll show that link in a second because I'm still sharing the screen. But these steps are configurable. The nice thing about them, if you want to move them around, you can actually simply drag and drop via the handle to move those steps around. And the colors are up to you to choose and do with what you want. It's all just pretty easily configurable by you. And it can be specific to each of your projects in your content subscription. And that's the basic setup of the first workflow. And we may have talked about that a little bit too much, but I hope you get the idea that there's a lot you can do with it. One other thing that you can do with the advanced plans in content is actually have multiple workflows for different types of content. So traditionally, you might have one workflow that applies to all content types because you want to work all in one way with your team. But the newer ability of content allows you to have actually specific additional workflows for specific content types. And this is an example where it's a legal approval workflow. It only applies to the article content type, not all of the other types in the project. And on this one, we actually maybe want the legal team to simply review. So I have a step named legal review, and I have the legal team and project managers as the only roles that can handle these workflows. Anything you want to add there, Ondrej, as I've talked quite a bit about it?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that you don't have to define the workflow before you start working on content, right? Because it's exactly the same as content model. Getting the content model right the first time you actually touch it is nearly impossible, I think. Or at least I see it in our projects that we work on the content model continuously because sometimes we add new components, sometimes we see that some content types are not working for us or they are too complicated. So workflow is the same. Sometimes you find out maybe I need another workflow step. Maybe I decided to add translations into the project. I added new languages. So in those cases, you can go ahead and change the workflow steps. You can also add new workflows. And in this case, there's the big question: what happens with content, right? Even as you're changing content types, there's always the question in the back of your mind: when I delete this, is it going to delete all of my data? In case of workflows, when you add a new workflow and you specify, as you see here, that there is a content type article, and you save the workflow, it doesn't mean that all the articles that you have in the system, if they're published, if they're in draft, wherever, they're not going to be automatically converted. only when you create a new one, a brand new one article, it's going to use that workflow. And for the rest of the articles, the system is going to give you a way or an option that you can transition from that one workflow to the new one. Yeah, so it gives you some kind of a stepping stone into the new workflow to make sure that, because there may be large content teams working on it. Yeah, and if you create a workflow, maybe you're just testing something, you don't want to have all the content editors curious about what's going on, why I can't change my content, because you may remove access from that content item for them. So it can be a slow process that helps you fine tune the workflow to really match your needs.
Right. And actually, I'll show you that, because that's something that tripped me up a little bit in preparing for today's episode, because it's maybe slightly hidden in the interface. This is an article that was a part of the sample starting project for all time. It's been there for forever, right? And I only recently added in the second workflow for the article legal review process that we've talked about. So when I first went to this and said, you know what, I actually need to make a new version and maybe change this back, I hit the steps, and I still saw the original workflow steps in the list. And that threw me off a little bit, because I'm like, well, wait a minute. I just made articles part of legal review workflow, not the default workflow. And now I'm not seeing all those correct things. And Ondrej actually helped me basically show that the panel here of information about a content item is telling me that I'm in the default workflow still, because our new workflow was added after this content item was created. And when I hover over default, it's giving me the little edit icon that says, hey, this type of content or this item is available to be chosen to a different workflow. And now I can change it and choose the dropdown to change the workflow to legal approval, change that workflow. And now we're seeing that noted here that the workflow is currently the legal approval for this coffee article. And then when I go to change the steps or publish, I see that now I'm actually in kind of that legal review step. And I have the steps that I'm assuming would be, available to me in that legal review. So that kind of fixed the situation that we just described, basically. And I think that's pretty cool that you can actually not worry about slowing down your content creators or editors just because you want to add a technical governance thing around it. Whereas I have definitely seen that break in other content management systems over the years.
Right. And you've seen the UI. It's not really shouting to the world, hey, change me. I'm workflow, change me, please, now. Because it's not meant to be used frequently. Yeah, the UI is optimized for the editor's experience, and the editor should be working on content mainly. Yeah, they should have a great experience moving between workflow steps, adding tasks, and setting due dates and everything. But workflow shouldn't be like their daily task. Yeah, so the UI kind of suggests that this can be changed, but it's not shouting that to the world.
Now, one other thing I think is important, if this is a new concept to you, or if you're new to content, is you really can't consider workflows without roles. And that's an important combination that usually the reason you have a complex workflow is you want different team members to do different things. And maybe you actually want to lock down certain types of content where only one group of people can manage that and edit it, but others can't. Or you still have your content marketing top level person who is maybe a director, who they're the last point of approval, but they're not going to worry too much about actually writing or creating the words in the content item. So I would definitely encourage you all to, before you actually configure everything in content, maybe even step back and draw out in your head how the steps of content in your process of creation apply to which roles. And you actually want to create the roles and put the people in roles first before fully defining the workflows. So from the order of operations, that security aspect plays into using workflows, at least in my experience. And I don't know if you would agree with that or not, Ondrej.
Yeah, I definitely would. But obviously, you're working on client projects, so I would trust you with this.
Sure. All right. So that's kind of the basics of the setup. You have content items, they go into workflows. Workflows can have configurable steps. that you can transition from one to the other. You can go forward to published. You can go back to draft. That's all pretty easy to understand stuff, we hope. If not, let us know in the comments. But I think it makes sense to actually transition to maybe how this is used in a full real world example. Ondrej, what do you think? Do you want to show the listeners how this maybe works with our project?
Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let me switch back over. I'm going to take my screen off the feed here, and I'm going to add yours in. Are you ready, sir?
Yeah, I think so. I hope that I'm not going to show something that I don't want to, which always happens. But
all right, here we go.
Let's see. Hopefully, we can cut it out. So this is a project that we're using with the MVPs. Now, if you don't know who MVPs are, it's a most valued professionals, a group of people that we really value for content. Brian is the member of the team. Is the team that consists of content enthusiasts, community members that are really happy to help the community. They share their experience and so on. I guess we can talk an hour about the team and what goes on. But just so you know, we're using a project here to track all the activities and to track the authors as well. Now, what you see here is, let me switch to the 2022 collection. So we're using that for to distinguish the years. But what I want to show you is that there is the content type activity used, right? That stands for any kind of activity. The next one is author, which you see this is a list of all the MVPs, and we're kind of mixing those together. Yeah, if you want to take a look, we can take a look at the content model for activity. There is an author that is linked to an author content type, right? So a fairly simple content model, I think. Only two content types there, activity and author. And we have one special thing there called scheduler. I'm going to get to that in a moment. That will be something for a tech audience. But what you should see here on the workflows is that there are two workflows. As Brian mentioned at the start, there is a default workflow that applies to everything. That is still the draft, scheduled, and archived. Those are the three basic steps that are always there. And the workflow is used to any content type not specified in other workflows. In other words, this is your fallback. If you don't specify a content type for a specific workflow, it's going to use the default one. Now, what we do have here is another one called activities. And that's a workflow only for activities. You see, it's limited to a content type activity. Now, why we implemented this is we're also tracking articles, and we always want to see the impact of an article, how many page views it got, or a video, how many views it got. And in the past, we always forgot to remember that in 2 weeks we should get back, or in a month we want to look back and see the actual numbers so that we can evaluate. So what this workflow does for us is, based on the content and based on what the MVP adds in, it actually transitions through the workflow steps towards the publishing state. But it has a lot of steps. So here you see that when we switch from draft to process, this is actually an automatic process that I will talk about in a minute. But then it can go to waiting for evaluation or waiting for approval. In case we're tracking activity like a provided feedback or something that can be evaluated right away, it doesn't make sense to wait for evaluation, right? Then we can switch directly to evaluate. So in this case, we can even go to waiting for approval in case there is no evaluation needed for some activities. And for some activities, when we're waiting for evaluation, like the blog posts that I mentioned, we switch to evaluate in a certain amount of time, and then we do the evaluation, and then we switch to waiting for approval. So it's like two branches that each require different conditions to be met. And then, of course, they merge back just before they are published. So it's not the complicatedest of all the workflows, but I think it works well in our case. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We totally forget to do this if there was nothing that was helping us out to do this.
And the great thing about this is, this is the workflow as we set it up in Kontent. If this was a normal project, you would have to choose the workflow on your own. which is perfectly fine. You could just add activity, and you know that you want to get back to this in 2 weeks. So you set up a due date in 2 weeks and move it to a specific workflow step, right? But in our case, because we are tech nerds, I figured, why do something that can be done automatically, right? So what we do have here in place is a special mechanism that consists of a few serverless functions. And it works in a way that when you create a new item here, I don't think that this is going to work because we're in a different environment, but I'll just explain it, right? When you create a new item, activity, and call this one Kontent Rocks, I could add myself here. Obviously, I'm archived because I'm not an MVP, but for testing purposes, I'm there. So I add myself here. I do the rest I fill the rest of the fields, and then I change the workflow step to process. Now you see, I can't do anything else because I always need to go from draft to process. There's just no other way. And when I do that, there's a serverless function that takes over. And when you see, I'm just going to switch back to the activities workflow to show you that the process workflow step is configured that, oh, actually, MVPs can work with this, but I think that they cannot change anything in there.
Yeah, I don't think we can.
Yeah.
Typically, yeah. Yep.
So once this gets to process, you cannot really change anything. When it goes to waiting for evaluation or waiting for approval, you see that MVPs can no longer work with this step. Yeah. So only the system can work with it. Project manager, as you know, even the API needs to have some credentials. Now, what happens there is, and I'm going to switch to code now. Yeah, a friendly warning. What happens there is Netlify function takes over. That's the process new item serverless function that is actually triggered by the webhook. Yeah, so we have a webhook in place that waits for a transition step from a single workflow to another, from single workflow step to another. And what this does is, let me find the interesting part. So here it is. So the only thing this does, apart from the API calls, is it takes the type of the activity. We have the multiple choice there that says article, blog post, and so on. And based on what kind of type it is, it's gonna move that item to a specific workflow step, and it's gonna schedule another move to another workflow step. Yeah, so it says move to waiting for evaluation step right now, and then it's gonna schedule in 14 days. It's gonna move to another workflow step automatically. Or if it's a different type, it's gonna assign the reviewer, which will be another MVP. And it's going to move to another workflow step, which in this case is, I think, yeah, here we have workflow step waiting for approval. Yeah, so this is a very simple one if that actually decides what's happening. And that's the scheduler that I talked about. Oh, here it was. Yeah, we can go back here, 2022. And the scheduler actually contains just the JSON of when each item should move to another workflow. Yeah. And this is again then processed by another serverless function that runs every 2 days on Netlify. So Netlify finally has scheduled functions. Mm-hmm. So it's really easy to run this every other day and check what's happening here. And if a specific activity should be moved to another workflow step, that happens. It happens all automatically. And the function also sends a message to Discord to the specific author of the item saying, hey, Brian, I know that this item should now be evaluated. Please take a look. And Brian can go ahead, open the specific item and work with the content item. So only with specific activities and specific workflow steps. And the management API of the serverless function that actually works through the business logic and moves the item through the workflow based on those rules.
I love it. I mean, I love how we're showing how webhooks and serverless functions can be combined with workflow and content to really create powerful solutions for real world problems, right? That's what we've just done here is we're looking for that second approval of a different MVP or the project manager to validate these things as our social code calls for it in our group. And no one has to remember to do this because, again, it was getting missed in years past. And I think you've done a great job, Ondrej, of showing off how powerful this can be.
And of course, I show the secret as well. So, when we finish this podcast, I'm just going to regenerate it.
No worries. We'll get that taken care of, or I can edit it. Either way. And as a reminder, we've talked about it a couple times, so I want to show this again. Discord is a great place to ask questions about content, even talk to the MVPs, talk to Ondrej, other people on the product team, participate in it. So if you're at all using content, I can't recommend it more than to join up. I mean, if you're not there, go do that right now. Don't even finish the podcast. We'll just say it's that important. And honestly, based off time here, Ondrej, I think we're gonna have to wrap it up a little bit. I mean, this whole concept is, we could probably talk more about serverless functions, webhooks. There's all sorts of other topics we could keep going on, but I think we'll call it here for today. If what I'm going to do though is I'm going to throw up your Twitter handle. So I definitely would recommend following Ondrej on Twitter or subscribing to his channel on YouTube, because he places a lot of great sort of tips and tricks and news and best practices around using content in all sorts of different languages and technologies. And it's just a great resource. So definitely want to thank you, Ondrej, for joining the show today. Great in showing off the tools. We should probably also say, if you're curious about, maybe starting from scratch, the best way to get set up and start using workflows is to follow some of the documentation that's out there at the docs site at content.ai/learn. That's actually the new URL where you can find, I think there's tutorials, there's documentation, there's API documentation, there's change logs. Great place to find out more about what content offers and how it's been continually improving over the years, which is something we always appreciate from it. But with that, I think we'll call it. This has been the Kontent Rocks podcast. And thank you very much, Ondrej, for joining us today.
Thanks, Brian, for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. Well, we'll have you again.
Looking forward to it. See ya.
Right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.